This August marks the 10-year anniversary of the arrival of Hurricane Katrina on the Gulf Coast, the worst natural disaster in this nation's history. And ironically, it was also at this month was the 10th trip that Vision Club made to the Gulf Coast to engage in volunteer activities. Vision Club, by the way, stands for Volunteers at Service in Our Neighborhoods, and it's made up of juniors and seniors who pay their own airfare, give up their Easter break, and fly to Mississippi to engage in this relief work. When people hear the words Hurricane Katrina, they almost automatically think of New Orleans. And while there was tremendous property damage and loss of life in New Orleans, very few people know that the epicenter of the storm was actually in a small coastal town called Bay St. Louis, about an hour east of New Orleans. It was in this town that there was a 32-foot storm surge, a 3-story tsunami, if you will, that came ashore. When I talk to family and friends about my annual trek to Mississippi, a couple of questions invariably arise, one of which is, do they really still need assistance in rebuilding down there? And another question is, why do you go to the same place each year? The answer to the first question is quite simple. Yes, they still do need rebuilding activities. I took these pictures at the start of this month. And the answer to the second question, why do you go to the same place each year? I went down there for the first time about 2 months after the storm. I went down with a colleague of mine, Joe Murray, who was a physical education teacher here. And we went down ostensibly to do debris removal. We had no intention of taking students, and we had no intention of going back for a second trip. While we were there, Joe ran some chainsaws and I ran a bobcat, and we moved chunks of concrete, and we chopped up large live oak trees that had fallen on people's houses and landed in their yards, and we put them out on the street to be picked up by the Corps of Engineers. And one of my jobs prior to going down here was to try to find a place for us to stay. And one of the things that the people told us was that the size of the devastation of this area was about the size of the landmass of the state of Michigan. And so you can imagine when you have an area of devastation this large, it's not going to be cleaned up in 2 or 3 or even 5 years. And so as I was looking for accommodations, it didn't take long for me to find out that all of the hotels and motels had been blown away. And so I did finally center upon a small building about 2 blocks up from the beach called the Main Street United Methodist Church. And when I knocked on this door and asked about accommodations, the response I received was almost biblical. The lady said to me, "We really don't have any more room for volunteers, but if you don't mind, you can sleep on the sanctuary floor." And so we had our sleeping bags, and that's what we did. Keep in mind, this is the end of November, and this church had no heat. And we were advised not to drink the water from the water fountains. And if we wished to take a shower, there was one shower outdoors that accommodated about 55 people. And if we wished to eat, we needed to make contact with the Red Cross truck that came through town twice a day. And despite these rather Spartan conditions, and difficult environment, the people who worked in this church did some phenomenal things in the way of assisting people to recover from this storm. When my 2 weeks was up and it was time for me to come home, I packed up my truck and I made the drive from Bay St. Louis to Pittsburgh. I drove straight through 18 hours, and I dropped my friend Joe off on the other side of town. And I made my way back home, and I arrived there about 1 o'clock in the morning on December 5th. When I entered my house through my kitchen door, the first thing that struck me was the warmth of the house. Just to the right of my kitchen door was my refrigerator, stocked full of fresh food. To the left of that was my filtered water system that I could visit anytime I wanted to. To the left of that, my microwave, then the range, and so on and so on. And I knew that I could stop into a couple of different bathrooms, and I could take a long, hot shower any time of the day or night. And perhaps best of all, on the second floor, I had a bed that was a couple of feet off of the floor. And when I stood in this doorway and I took all of this in, I'm not ashamed to tell you that I wept, because I had left hundreds, if not thousands of people back in Mississippi who were without these luxuries, things that I had taken for granted most of my adult life, and that which I have not taken for granted since. And I knew also that these hundreds, if not thousands of people would be without these luxuries for months, and in some instances, years to come. And so I decided right then and there that I needed to go back. Even if it meant helping only one person restore some semblance of normalcy following this storm. And so Vision Club started with very modest numbers. That same school year, Joe and I took down 3 senior boys. And the popularity of this club absolutely exploded, so that 3 or 4 years ago, I ended up taking my largest group of 42 students and 11 adults for a total of 53 volunteers. Now, since then, I've tried to scale it back a little bit so that the number is a little bit more workable. So we take about 40 from that point onward. Despite the wonderful accomplishments that these kids have done, and there are many, believe me, if you could think of any sort of construction work that's out there, we've probably done it. Despite these amazing accomplishments, the true value of these trips is actually the change and the growth that have come over these kids. And one of the joys I've encountered in taking these trips is seeing the kids come to realize that altruism is addictive and volunteerism is contagious. And an additional joy is getting them to see the truth in the adage that it truly is better to give than it is to receive. Thank you.